shouldn't have existed. By all the laws of history, by every pattern of conquest we know, this kingdom should have been swept away in a matter of months. A small strip of green along the Nile, standing in the path of the single greatest military expansion the world had ever seen. But it didn't fall. For 700 years, while empires collapsed and maps were redrawn, they held the line. And then, they vanished. In the middle of the 7th century, the known world was being remade. The old giants, Rome, Persia, were shattering under the weight of a new force rising from the Arabian Peninsula. The Rashidun Caliphate was not just an army, it was a phenomenon. It moved with a speed and a certainty that terrified the generals of Constantinople and Ctesiphon. In just a few decades, they had taken Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and the vast expanse of the Persian Empire. It seemed inevitable. It seemed like destiny. But then the wave hit a wall. Down the Nile, past the Great Pyramids and the Roman garrisons of Egypt, lay a land the ancients called Nubia. To the Romans, it was a frontier. To the Arabs, it was a land of mystery. But to the people living there, it was the kingdom of Makuria. They were Christians, but not the kind the Byzantine emperor would have recognized. They were warriors, but they didn't fight like the legions, and when the unstoppable force of the Caliphate turned south, expecting another easy conquest, they walked into a slaughter. This isn't just a story about a battle, it's a mystery. Because after the fighting stopped, something even stranger happened. A treaty was signed. A treaty that broke every rule of Islamic diplomacy and Christian zealotry. A treaty that created a cold peace for 7 centuries. Why did the Caliphate stop? Why did they allow a Christian kingdom to thrive on their southern border for nearly a millennium? And why, after surviving the greatest threat of the Middle Ages, did Makuria eventually dissolve into the sand, leaving behind only silence and buried cathedrals? You may have heard the legend of the Nubian archers, but the full story is stranger. Today, we are opening the lost chapter of the African kingdom that defied an empire. To understand why Makuria is such an anomaly, we have to look at the world in 641 A.D. It was a world on fire. Amr ibn al-As, one of the most brilliant generals of the Rashidun army, had just completed the conquest of Egypt. Alexandria, the jewel of the Mediterranean, had fallen. The grain of the Nile Delta was now feeding the armies of the Caliphate. The Byzantines were fleeing into the sea. The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. The Arabs weren't just winning. They were dismantling the superpowers of antiquity with terrifying efficiency. North Africa lay open to the west, but to the south, the Nile continued. For Amr ibn al-As, the logic was simple: expansion, security. The southern border of Egypt had always been a problem, even for the pharaohs. If you hold Egypt, you have to secure the south. It's a rule of geography. So he sent a probe, a reconnaissance in force, 20,000 men. Now put yourself in the saddle of one of those cavalrymen. You are a veteran. You have seen the heavy cavalry of the Persians shatter. You have seen the disciplined legions of Rome break formation and run. You believe, with absolute certainty, that you are part of a divine wind. You are riding south into what you think is a tribal backwater. You expect scattered resistance. You expect to impose the jizya tax, establish a garrison, and move on. But Nubia was not a tribal backwater. The region was actually divided into 3 kingdoms: Nobadia in the north, Alodia in the far south, and sandwiched between them, the most powerful of them all, Makuria. Its capital was Old Dongola, a fortress city built on the rocky banks of the Nile. This was a civilization that had been Christian for nearly a century. But like the landscape, their faith was hardened by the sun. They were isolated. They were independent. And they were waiting. The Arab chroniclers who wrote about what happened next don't sound like conquerors. They sound confused. They sound horrified. They didn't encounter a mob. The Second Battle of Dongola in 652 is one of the most pivotal sieges you have never heard of. It is the moment where the history of Africa could have split in two very different directions. The Arab forces laid siege to the city. They brought catapults, stone-throwing machines the Nubians had never seen before. The primary target wasn't just the walls, it was the cathedral, the symbolic heart of the kingdom. The bombardment was terrifying, but the Makurians didn't break. King Khalid led a defense that was aggressive, mobile, and relentless. They launched sorties. The pupil smiters struck the siege crews and vanished back behind the walls. The Arab cavalry found themselves trapped in a grinder. And then something rare happened, a stalemate. Abdullah ibn Sa'ad did the math. He could take the city, maybe, but the cost would be enormous. And even if he did, could he hold it? So he stopped the bombardment, and King Khalid opened the gates, not to surrender but to talk. What followed was not a truce. It was not a pause. It was something unprecedented. They signed the Baqt. The Baqt is one of the strangest treaties in medieval history. It defined relations between Christian Nubia and Muslim Egypt for nearly 700 years. Makuria would remain independent. They would keep their king, their laws, their faith. In exchange, they would send an annual tribute, 360 slaves per year. But Egypt had to send goods back: grain, wine, horses, cloth. It looked like tribute, but it functioned like trade. The Baqt was not mercy, it was containment. Makuria was better as a buffer than a battlefield, but the peace came at a cost. To fulfill the treaty, Makuria raided further south, protecting itself by preying on others. A moral compromise, a survival strategy. And it worked. For centuries, Makuria was quiet. Umayyad. While much of the Christian world burned, Makuria entered a golden age. Old Dongola became a metropolis of the Nile. Cathedrals rose. Murals bloomed across stone walls. Kings ruled as priest monarchs. Muslim merchants were allowed to trade, but never to settle. The Makurians survived by being useful, but never threatening. But peace breeds complacency. As dynasties rose and fell in Cairo, Makuria weakened from within. And when the Mamluks took power, they didn't see a partner, they saw a prize. The end of Makuria did not come with a conquest, it came with suffocation. The Baqt broke down, civil wars erupted, foreign powers chose kings, the economy collapsed. Arab settlers moved in, not as invaders, but as neighbors. The archers faded, the discipline faded. In 1317, a Muslim king took the throne of Dongola. The heart of the Christian kingdom became a mosque. Makuria did not vanish overnight. It fragmented, it faded, until it became a ghost. For 700 years, Makuria held the gate. They proved that empire was not destiny. But in the end, it wasn't an army that defeated them. It was time. Today, the desert has reclaimed almost everything. And yet, beneath the sand, the story remains. History remembers the conquerors. But sometimes, the most incredible stories are found in the silence, in the borders that didn't move, and in the buried cathedrals where forgotten prayers were spoken for centuries. What other kingdoms are still waiting for us to ask the right questions?